We're going to look at two things. One is the Humanistic script and the Roman types, as we call them, which were based on it. First of all, Gothic of the late Middle Ages. Here's a practical piece of writing, a medical text. And if we look at the bottom right-hand part, which I've enlarged on the right here, two things are obvious. One is that it's very, very tightly packed. Small letters closely joined together, and a lot of abbreviations. If we look at an earlier piece of writing, and this is the so-called Carolingian script, round about 1000, we can see that it's much freer. The lines are separated, the words are separated. There are not many abbreviations, though to be fair, there are some abbreviations for what are known as holy names. So DNS stands for Dominus, Lord, and this is a psalm. And DNS again is abbreviated. But there we are. The poet Petrarch said that he could read it easily. Simple and clear was his word for it. Castigata et clara. And Petrarch, as a poet, Francesco Petrarca, was highly influential as a literary figure. Salutati, Coluccio Salutati, had an important political post in Florence, but he was a scholar too. And then two other names which are worth putting down. Poggio, usually known by that first name, although Bracciolini is a family name. And then Nicoli. Both of them wrote for a living, and particularly in the case of Poggio. Here's an example of Poggio right at the very beginning of the 15th century. And the capital letters may not be very inscriptional, but they are kind of Roman capital letters. The small letters, the minuscules, are a very, very close adaptation of that Carolingian hand of some hundreds of years earlier. So much so that the small s, which you get at the end of writing in Gothic, has gone. So in the second line of the small letters, arguas, there's a lowercase letter, as we would call it, at the end of the word, and in the line following it, cuius. And then in the fourth line down, et opera. There is your ampersand, the way we saw it in a Carolingian hand. And that would stay attached to this form of writing. Well, that's 1402. 20 years later, he was really writing the same kind of hand, except I suppose his name was far better known. So here is the end of the text of a Roman historical piece by the writer Livy. But the scribe himself has his name bigger than the title of the book, Poggio. Here's the other scribe, Nicoli. There were many more of them, but these are two very well-known names. Nicoli wrote a kind of a more formal hand, upright hand, but he's well known for perhaps originating, certainly writing from a quite early date, a kind of cursive. So again, capital letters, fairly Roman ones at the beginning of this text, but then the cursive form. But notice still no short S's. The long S is right at the end of the lines. Well, this is a remark made by a very distinguished student of early writing, Ullmann, who in 1960 said that it was Poggio and Nicoli who produced the models for Roman and Italic. Is that right? In fact, it's becoming more and more likely that their writing was based on the writing of professional scribes in the city of Padua. And they've got an example in this online essay by Olocco showing the handwriting of Bartolomeo Sanvito. Notice, by the way, in the third line down, non est mihi, a letter H. That's kind of significant. Riccardo Olocco is a scholar who has done a lot of research in this area and was awarded PhD for his thesis in 2019. And parts of it are being published piece by piece in other media, including, as you see here, the Printing Historical Society journal. A scribe working in Padua in Italian. Bartolomeo Sanvito is a name that's become more and more widely researched and well worth bearing in mind. This is an example of quite a small format text of the Latin writer Cicero in the V&A Museum, and it's written on fine vellum. Notice, by the way, that this is the end of the book, and the second line down in the finishing lines, you've got Cicero's initials and the title of his text, De Officiorum. But this is finished in Rome on Monday, the 2nd of, and here he's had to change whatever it was, but November is what he calls it here. Let's come back to printing type. Here is a fairly standard round Gothic used by the Fust and Schöffe printing office, and fairly standard form of type for its period. But another one is kind of coming up behind. There at the left is the Gothic. There on the right is something less Gothic, let's call it. And it's a piece of type made by two strangers, refugees perhaps, but certainly working outside Germany, in the town of Subiaco, not far from Rome. And if we look at their text type, it's got Roman features, let's call them. That Q, that capital E, the capital A. These are all are Roman capitals, from Roman inscriptions, which have in a way been revived, like the work of Poggio. The most familiar example of this new kind of humanistic printing type is, of course, that of Jensen. I won't go into his life in detail, but he's not Italian, he's French, but working in Venice. He was sent in the 1450s to see what Gutenberg was doing in Mainz, news of which had already got to France. Did he ever go back? We just don't know. One suggestion is he might even have stayed in Mainz for a while, learning this new technology of making type. At any rate, here in 1470, he is certainly making type in Venice. One letter to spot in this example is that letter H on the right-hand side. It's like a letter N with an ascender. That's new in type. And it'll become the standard form of M that we're used to. But you don't find that in other types of the period. Here, for example, on the left is another printer in Venice in the 1470s, and here the letter H, like that of Gothic handwriting and type too, curls back on itself. Hoch in the first line, Erhardum. And this is the work of this German Erhard Ratdolt. On the right you have a kind of, not quite, but nearly upright script of San Vito, and notice in the second line, Bancale, and in the bottom line, Arco, the letter H has this N-like form. Well, we've seen this page of San Vito. This is the San Vito we're talking about. Another form of letter in which San Vito was very expert, so I'm showing it here, it's the title page, in effect, of a manuscript of a little book on cookery of the 1460s, and this variation of colour from line to line was one of his specialities. So there it is, very beautiful, pen-drawn Roman capitals. Back to Jensen then. Before we leave Jensen, note, I suppose, in some ways, a key letter. The letter E, the lowercase letter E, has this this oblique angle, like that of many scribes with their pen. One other thing before we leave Jensen. In some of his type, letters like T do actually overlap the following letter, if it can be done. And that's the case in the first of these examples. But the one below, as you see, does not overlap the letter E that follows. That's purely a technical note. Jensen changed in a way from his humanistic Roman to a rotunda Gothic. And a very fine rotunda Gothic it was too. But many of the books for the last 5 years of his life, till he died in 1480, are set in this round Gothic. I've shown you an example of the work of Ratdolt, who produced some very fine books, and I'm just adding one or two examples from what he printed. Here's a historical text of 1477. That's printed by Ratdolt, and Mahler and Löslein were his two associates. Here's a detail of that particular colophon ending to the work. And one thing that always intrigues me is the question of whether that flat top to the A had any influence on a certain wood engraver called Dürer, who adopted a flat-topped A for his initials in his woodcuts. I don't know. And just to finish with Ratdolt, I suppose it's worth looking at his type specimen of 1486. He went back to his hometown, Augsburg, and here is his type specimen, the earliest thing of its kind we know, and this very fine online version you can see in the reproductions of the Bavarian State Library. Let's concentrate now on another printer back in Venice, and this is a certain Francesco da Bologna. That's all we ever see in print. Francesco from Bologna, the city. And it's an essay in classical Latin, very deliberately imitating the great Roman authors, by Bembo. Pietro Bembo was a rising young churchman, but here he's showing off his Latin in an essay on the volcano Etna in Sicily. So here is his De Etna, and it's a type which looks pretty normal, which it is. It's a type which, on the whole, all our Roman types have followed to some extent. It was printed, as he says, and this is slightly confusing, in what he says is 1495, but then it's in February, and in our counting that would be 1496. Well, here it is. There's the name of Sicily and Etna too, and in many ways it's this very, very normal type. The E has gone horizontal. That bar went horizontal with this particular printer, and it stayed that way ever since. And there are other features which we'll look at. Right at the bottom, quibus, that lowercase s is curiously narrow and slightly sloping forwards, really rather like a Roman inscriptional letter. And the capitals are just slightly lower than the ascending stroke of Sicily, Sicilia. And these are features that would get to be an influence on other type makers. So there are the two features, the sloping bar in Jensen's E, the horizontal one in Griffo's. There are other differences too in some of Griffo's letters. There's a very curious, almost a capital P, side by side with one which seems more normal. On the right you can see a kind of flourished A, as well as a more normal one. So there's quite a lot of experimenting going on in this De Aetna, the first use of this type. A few more. There in the second line down, you've got this A like an N, just to remind you that it's rather similar to the N, which is the first letter in that line. You've got another flourished form, a swash letter as it came to be known. So a normal E and one to, on the whole, put at the end of a word. And there, of course, in the second line, you've got this rather curious P. Lastly, among these variants, and an important one because it had for a while quite an influence, the capital G, the capital M don't really have a right-hand serif. There's a kind of bit of one in both cases, but on the whole they're not there. And where the M is concerned, this really did have an influence for a while, which we should be looking at. Was it unusual? Not entirely, no. Here's a rather nice example of a clearly quite calligraphically modelled Roman inscription. And no right-hand serif to M. If that's a brush letter, it didn't need one. So there you are. There is Griffo's M, and there is the Roman model, which he must have found somewhere. Two more books with a Griffo type. One is this curious book, Aldus Manutius, the Latin form of name that he used, tended to concentrate on Greek texts, but he did some Latin ones too. This is a curious exception to his work. It's quite big, it's a folio, and it's not in Italian, Latin, or Greek, or rather it's in all three languages. It's a very, very curious language. And it's a kind of fantasy text, the account of a dream by the author. Type is the type we've seen in use for the De Aetna, but it's had a hard life, and 4 years later it's clearly getting worn. There are the two. And it may be that Griffo was getting ready to quit the printing setup of Aldus. It's got new capitals, and that's one reason why I'm showing it here. The capitals of the De Aetna font are really quite bold and heavy on the page, and it's been queried whether they really belong. At any rate, in the Polyphilus, the capitals match the weight of the lowercase more, as you can see from the letter M here. That text of this writer who finds himself back in ancient Rome in a dream is illustrated with some extraordinary woodcuts, which again is very unusual for Aldus. And here it is in one of the woodcuts showing that the author is dreaming of an altar with an inscription on it. And the inscription, he says, is in perfect capital letters. This enthusiasm for the inscriptional letter of ancient Rome, which was so widespread. And of course here they're set in the capitals of the font. One last type. In 1501, Aldus Manutius brings out a quite different kind of book and a type to go with it. The format is quite small. It's what became the classic paperback format of 18 by 10 centimeters. The type is a cursive. Before we move on, notice that Aldus has introduced a kind of printer's mark. A dolphin and an anchor, supposedly the speed of the dolphin and the steadiness of the anchor, combined as a symbol of his work. Here's the new type, and we'll look at it more closely. It's Roman poetry. Is it done to save space? It often used to be said, but Harry Carter simply said no, it doesn't really save any space at all. Roman type on this size of body would get in just as much. Well, that needs to be decided. But here is a detail of that page, and we can go in just a bit closer. Because this enables us to see that, yes, it's based on a cursive hand, and it has a number of joined up letters. In that second line, a double L, a U, M, and so on. Not as many as some Gothic types, but even so, it must have taken some trouble to make these work. He did in fact refine it, this script type. We know that he's said to have broken up with Aldus and moved to the town of Fano, which is on the Adriatic coast, a little further south, to work for a certain Soncino, and this is the italic that Soncino got from him. Far fewer ligatures, by the way, are double F ligature, but not many others, and I think it improves the look of the type. Well, there we are. A fascinating character, because the types of Francesco Grifo, as we shall see, have an enormous influence on later Roman type. But first of all, we'll leave with a couple of remarks. According to Soncino, Gershom Soncino, he did all the types that Aldus used: Greek, Roman, and Italic. So says Soncino, and he was in a position to know. And finally, the praise for his work, which is very rare at this time, and, says Soncino, he invented the italic. So there we have Grifo, to whom we'll return.